The night was heavy with silence, the kind of silence that presses against the chest and makes every breath feel like it might shatter something sacred. In the distance, the faintest shimmer of candlelight flickered against the dark horizon. Men, women, and even children walked in lines that seemed endless, their faces hidden in shadow, their steps synchronized as if guided by an unseen hand. They were not speaking, yet their silence roared louder than any hymn. It was as though the night itself had become a cathedral, and every rustle of fabric, every crunch of gravel underfoot, was part of a ritual long rehearsed. At the front of the procession walked a man, tall, gaunt, his hands clasped as though in prayer. His voice, low and rhythmic, carried just enough for those closest to hear. Fragments of his sermon echoed, "The river is the gate, the water is the passage, we shall be cleansed, and we shall be reborn." The people behind him, hundreds strong, nodded in reverence. Some wept openly, not from fear but from something that looked disturbingly like relief. Others held their children tightly, whispering to them, promising that this night was the fulfillment of everything they had ever hoped for. No one questioned where they were going. No one resisted the pull of the river. The world has recorded many tragedies, but few with this particular weight of strangeness. This was not a massacre where armed men forced innocents into violence. This was not a natural disaster where victims were caught unaware. This was something more chilling, an entire community, bound together by faith and fear, walking willingly into the arms of death. And it all began with the words of one man, the preacher who claimed to have been chosen. What kind of power rests in the human voice that it can convince hundreds to abandon their lives, their homes, and their children's futures, to step into black water under a moonless sky? How does belief become so consuming that it overrides the most basic instinct of survival? The answers are not simple. They are woven from desperation, hope, manipulation, and the ancient hunger for salvation. In the decades since that night, survivors have spoken in fragments, their words like broken glass, sharp, unfinished, impossible to piece together into a complete picture. Some say the preacher's voice was like honey, irresistible and soothing. Others claim it was closer to thunder, shaking them to the marrow, leaving no space for doubt. A few insist they remember nothing at all, as if their minds were fogged by something beyond human explanation. What remains certain is this: the preacher delivered a final sermon that night, one that would erase an entire town from the map. He promised his followers deliverance through water, and they followed him into the current without hesitation. The story you are about to hear is not simply about one man's madness, nor about a group of gullible souls who lost their way. It is about the fragile line that separates faith from fanaticism, hope from horror. It is about the way ordinary men and women, when cornered by desperation and guided by the wrong voice, can step together into the abyss. Imagine standing among them, the air damp, the sound of rushing water growing louder with every step. You look around and see neighbors you've known all your life, people you once laughed with in markets, worked beside in fields, now marching with eyes fixed ahead, as though hypnotized. You feel the cold air on your face, and a question rises inside you: am I the only one who wants to turn back? But no one turns. No one dares. The preacher stops at the edge of the river. The crowd gathers close, the children clutching their mothers, the men holding torches that sputter against the wind. He raises his arms toward the dark sky. His words rise and fall like waves: this is the night of deliverance. This is the crossing into the kingdom. Fear not the water, it is only the veil. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman sobs. Somewhere else, a boy whispers, "I'm afraid." But the preacher's voice swallows their fear, wrapping the moment in a kind of dreadful certainty. And then, without another word, he steps into the river. The water reaches his knees, his waist, his chest. Behind him, one by one, his followers follow. The sound of water splashing mixes with murmured prayers and muffled cries. The river accepts them, its current dark and unrelenting. By the time dawn broke, the town was silent. Homes stood empty. Fires and hearths had gone cold. What remained was a river swollen with secrets, carrying away the lives of those who had placed their faith in a man they believed was sent from God. It is from this night that our journey begins, a story of a preacher, a people, and a sermon that did not just promise salvation but demanded a sacrifice. A story that forces us to confront the darkest corners of belief and the terrifying question, what would it take for you to follow someone into the water? Because for this town, the answer was already given. Long before the river swallowed his congregation, he was just a boy. His name, now blurred by history and whispered only in survivor accounts, belonged once to a child who grew up in a house where silence was heavier than words. His father, a failed farmer, carried the bitterness of a man who believed God had abandoned him. His mother was devout but fragile, her faith unshakable yet tinged with desperation. It was in that small, creaking home, with scripture as the only escape and hardship as the only teacher, that the seed of the preacher's obsession first took root. He was not remarkable as a child, at least not in the ways the world usually notices. He was thin, pale, often overlooked in the fields where other boys worked. But he listened differently. When elders recited passages, he repeated them back with uncanny precision. When preachers raised their voices from pulpits, he studied their cadence like an apprentice learning the craft of a master. Even as a boy, he seemed less like someone absorbing sermons and more like someone rehearsing for his own. By adolescence, he had become restless. Accounts suggest he wandered from town to town, never staying in one place for long. He worked odd jobs, field hand, stable boy, even a gravedigger. And yet, everywhere he went, he seemed to gather people. Not many at first, just a handful who noticed the strange pull of his words. He spoke not of himself but of destiny, of how suffering was not random but chosen, of how the poor and the broken were closer to God than kings. To men worn down by labor, his words felt like dignity. To women exhausted by grief, his voice carried comfort. To outcasts, his presence was a kind of validation. But beneath his gentleness was a sharp edge. Survivors of his early days recall how quickly he could turn. One man said the preacher would soothe him with promises one moment, then glare with a fury that made him feel naked and condemned the next. This duality, compassion and cruelty intertwined, became the foundation of his power. He was not simply offering salvation, he was holding it hostage. What made him different from the dozens of self-proclaimed prophets that wandered those lands in that era? It was not simply his voice, though that voice was extraordinary, a low, resonant tone that could soften into a whisper or rise like thunder without effort. It was not his knowledge of scripture, though he seemed to recite verses as naturally as breathing. What set him apart was his absolute conviction. He did not preach possibilities, he declared certainties. Where other men said, "Perhaps God will deliver us," he declared, "I have seen the vision. The time is near. I am sent." That certainty was intoxicating. In a world trembling with famine, disease, and political unrest, certainty was rarer than gold. People clung to him not because they fully believed, but because they desperately wanted to. He offered not merely hope but a guarantee, and in desperate times, a guarantee is irresistible. As his circle of followers grew, he began to shape an identity for himself beyond just preacher. He spoke of visions that came to him in dreams, a voice that called him chosen. He told his followers that he had been anointed, not by earthly hands but by divine command. To question him was not simply to doubt a man, it was to doubt God's messenger. And who among the weary dared risk such a sin? It is said that the first sign of his supposed calling came one storm-filled night. The village where he was staying had been plagued by drought for months. Crops wilted, animals died, and every whispered prayer felt unanswered. That night, he stood before a gathered crowd and declared, "By tomorrow, the sky will weep for us." Those present later swore that the next day brought rain, a relentless storm that filled the rivers and soaked the fields. Was it coincidence? Likely. But to his followers, it was proof. Proof that he was, indeed, chosen. From that moment, his word was no longer questioned. People began selling what little they owned, offering it to him as gifts of faith. Mothers brought their sick children to him, and when the children recovered, as children sometimes do, the preacher claimed it as another miracle. Fathers confessed their sins, believing his prayers could erase them. The preacher's name, once unremarkable, became a title, the Chosen. Yet not everyone was convinced. There were whispers that the rainstorm had been nothing but luck, that his miracles were mere accidents dressed in scripture. But when a skeptic challenged him publicly, mocking his so-called visions, that man disappeared within the week. Some said he left town out of shame. Others believed darker rumors, that the preacher's followers had ensured his silence. Whatever the truth, the lesson was clear: those who opposed the Chosen did not last. His following grew not only in number but in devotion. They began to speak of him as if he were more than human. Some called him the new prophet. Others, the mouthpiece of God himself. And though he never directly claimed divinity, he never denied it either. Instead, he leaned into the ambiguity, allowing his followers to believe whatever made their devotion stronger. And yet, even as he basked in their reverence, there were cracks. Late at night, those closest to him claimed to hear him muttering, pacing as though haunted. He spoke of visions not only of light but of shadow, of floods and fire, of a great crossing that none could escape. His certainty remained, but its edges sharpened into something darker. Salvation was no longer a gift freely given, it was a test. A demand. The man who once soothed the broken with gentle words was becoming something else, something more dangerous. His sermons grew less about love and more about obedience. His visions were no longer about renewal, but about cleansing. It was here, in the transformation of a lonely, desperate boy into a man convinced of his own divine destiny, that the seeds of tragedy were fully planted. For when a man believes himself chosen, when he convinces others that his voice is the voice of God, there is little he cannot command. And soon, his commands would demand more than just faith. They would demand lives. To understand why an entire community followed the preacher into the river, we have to step back into the world they lived in, a world of cracked soil, hollow bellies, and prayers that seemed to dissolve before reaching the heavens. This was no ordinary town, and these were no ordinary people. They were survivors of neglect, poverty, and hunger, a people worn thin by years of promises from leaders who never came and by silence from a God they feared had abandoned them. The town itself was small, a scattering of wooden homes with sagging roofs, built near a river that had once been their lifeline. Decades earlier, the water carried fish in abundance, fertile silt for the fields, and safe passage to neighboring villages. But by the time the preacher arrived, the river had turned fickle. Some years it dried to a trickle, others it rose so violently it swept away crops and homes alike. The people had begun to call it, the river that takes as much as it gives. Famine had carved itself into the lines of their faces. The market stalls that once overflowed with grain now displayed little more than shriveled roots and rough bread. Children grew gaunt, their arms thin as twigs, their eyes too old for their years. The men tried to hold the town together, but each harvest grew smaller, and each winter harsher. The women, who once filled the evenings with songs while weaving by firelight, now sang only lullabies of endurance. Even laughter, the most stubborn of human sounds, had grown scarce. And it wasn't just hunger. Disease lurked in the shadows too. The damp climate carried fevers that could sweep through homes overnight, leaving behind grief as heavy as the river fog. Parents buried children. Children buried parents. Graves multiplied on the hill outside town until it looked less like a resting place and more like an accusation against heaven. In such soil, hope withers. But desperation? Desperation grows roots deeper than any crop. When the preacher first set foot in the town, he arrived not as a conqueror but as a companion. He walked among them, listening to their complaints, eating from their empty tables as though nothing tasted better. He spoke of their pain not with pity but with recognition. He told them he, too, knew hunger. He, too, had prayed in silence, waiting for an answer that never came. And yet, he claimed, in his darkest hour, he had been given a vision, that God had chosen this very town for deliverance. Imagine the effect of those words on people who had nothing left to believe in. Politicians had lied. Merchants had robbed them. Even nature itself seemed their enemy. But here was a man who looked them in the eye and said, "You are not cursed. You are chosen." For a people long treated as disposable, those words were more than comforting, they were intoxicating. Families who once quarreled began to gather together at dusk, drawn by the preacher's voice. Farmers left their tools to listen. Mothers carried their sick children to his sermons, clinging to every syllable as if the sound itself could heal. He was not merely preaching, he was breathing life into a place that had grown accustomed to death. But hope came at a cost. Slowly, the preacher began weaving fear into his promises. He warned that the world outside was corrupt, that only within the circle of his flock could salvation be found. He painted outsiders as threats, spies, heretics, agents of a world that had abandoned God. This message resonated with a people already isolated by poverty and geography. The town began to close in on itself, distrust growing toward anyone who questioned the preacher's authority. Still, there were skeptics. A few elders, hardened by years of false prophets, muttered against him. One old farmer scoffed, "A man with words cannot fill a stomach." But his defiance only seemed to strengthen the preacher's grip. For every doubter, there were 10 desperate souls ready to believe. And when those doubters started disappearing, first one, then another, the rest learned to keep their doubts silent. The rituals began subtly. At first, they were just extended prayers at dawn and dusk. Then came nights of fasting, where the whole town refrained from food to purify themselves. Soon, children were being brought forward to receive blessings, sometimes lasting hours as the preacher whispered verses into their ears, rocking them back and forth until they wept. Families gave up heirlooms, wedding rings, carved crosses, pieces of land, as offerings to God, entrusted into the preacher's care. These were not the acts of people bewitched overnight. They were the acts of people exhausted, broken down by years of suffering, who finally found someone promising that their suffering meant something. What makes this all the more chilling is how ordinary it looked at first. Outsiders visiting during this period noted how the townsfolk seemed strangely content, even joyful, despite their poverty. They spoke of how united the community had become, how crime and conflict had all but disappeared. But beneath that surface unity lay a growing undercurrent of fear, fear of disobedience, fear of questioning, fear of being cast out of the only hope they had left. One woman, years later, would recall, "It felt like living inside a dream. We were hungry, but we told ourselves it was holy hunger. We were tired, but we told ourselves it was the work of God. And every time doubt rose in our hearts, his voice was there to drown it." The preacher had not yet revealed the full extent of his vision, but the town was already caught in his net. He had given them identity, purpose, and belonging. For the first time in years, they felt chosen instead of forgotten. And for a people so desperate, that feeling was worth more than life itself. It was in this crucible of hunger and fear, hope and despair, that the preacher's sermons began to take on a new edge, one that promised deliverance not in this world, but in the next. And soon, he would ask them to prove their faith in ways no one could have imagined. The preacher's sermons were unlike anything the town had ever experienced. They began simply enough, a small gathering under the cracked beams of the old church, a handful of flickering candles casting shadows across the worn wooden pews. But soon, these gatherings became something more than mere sermons. They became ceremonies, performances, and psychological experiments all at once. Every word, every pause, every rise and fall of his voice was deliberate, calibrated to unsettle and enthrall at the same time. He spoke of God, of salvation, of sin, but always through the lens of immediacy and consequence. "The hour is upon us," he would say, voice low and insistent, "and only the faithful shall stand unscathed when the waters rise." There was a cadence to his speech, a rhythm that mimicked heartbeat, that quickened as he built tension, then lulled the listeners into a trance of attention. Children swayed in their parents' arms. Farmers leaned forward from the backs of the pews. Women wept quietly, their tears glinting in candlelight. No one noticed the hours slipping by. What made these sermons so dangerous was the way he blurred the lines between promise and threat. At times, he spoke with warmth, describing a future of endless light and peace. At other times, his tone turned sharp and slicing, warning of punishment so vivid it felt as though the air itself would burn. "Those who doubt me," he declared once during a stormy evening gathering, "will find the waters unforgiving. Their hearts, heavy with disbelief, shall drag them down." The townspeople shivered, yet they did not leave. They leaned in closer. His words were not idle. He would single out individuals, a skeptical farmer, a child who hesitated, a mother whose gaze lingered on her son too long, and weave them into the narrative of his sermon. "The boy with the restless eyes," he intoned one night, "he is chosen as all of you are, yet only if he does not falter." The crowd would murmur in anxious agreement, their eyes darting to the child. The preacher's influence grew not through coercion alone, but by teaching the town to police each other, to see themselves as part of a divine experiment. Over time, the sermons became longer, darker, more ritualistic. Candles were replaced with torches. Psalms were replaced with chants. Followers were instructed to fast, to meditate, to stand in silence until the preacher commanded movement. The sermons were no longer just words, they were endurance tests, mental drills that bound the community together in fear and devotion. But the real genius, or horror, of these sermons was the slow, almost imperceptible escalation of stakes. Early on, he spoke in metaphor, rivers of temptation, storms of sin, darkness in the soul. Then he began to hint at the literal, a river that cleansed, fire that purified, night as both friend and executioner. By the time he mentioned the Great Crossing, some already whispered among themselves, though few dared speak aloud. The townspeople, hungry for certainty and exhausted by hardship, could not resist. The sermons became addictive. People began to recount the words long after the gatherings had ended, memorizing them, repeating them, debating the hidden meanings. The preacher watched, his eyes glinting with satisfaction, as his congregation became ever more entwined with his will. Even minor doubts were quickly quelled, through a look, a word, or the subtle disappearance of a skeptic. One chilling account comes from a mother, years later, recalling a sermon that lasted until midnight. He spoke of rivers rising and hearts failing. And yet, he smiled at us, as if the fear itself was a gift. "My husband held my hand so tightly that I thought he might crush it. And when he told us that the faithful would know peace, I felt relief, though I could not name why. We were all trapped in his words, and we did not know it." The sermons did more than inspire devotion, they rewrote the town's reality. Every decision, every thought, every interaction became filtered through the preacher's lens. Work, rest, prayer, all were now measured against his teachings. Questions were no longer questions, they were sins. Desire was no longer natural, it was temptation. The town became a living sermon, a testament to his power, a microcosm of obedience and fear. Even outsiders began to take notice. Travelers and merchants reported the transformation. The town had an unnatural quiet, a rigidity in its routines, a way of watching strangers that was both polite and calculating. It was as if the sermons had created a social architecture of control, unseen but omnipresent, every brick cemented with whispered scripture. And then came the first hints of violence. Not overt, not physical at first, merely disappearances. A man who questioned the preacher's interpretation of scripture left for a neighboring town and never returned. A child who failed to fast properly was punished in ways the adults later refused to describe. Each incident, minor as it seemed, added weight to the sermons. They were no longer just guidance, they were commands with consequences. By the time the preacher's final, apocalyptic sermons arrived, the town was ready. They hung on every word, hearts pounding, bodies trembling, minds primed to obey without question. And when he spoke of the river as a path to salvation, a path that required complete faith, no one dared refuse. The sermons had not merely preached a message, they had rewritten morality itself. The danger of the preacher's words lay not only in their content but in their timing, their cadence, their psychological manipulation. He had transformed ordinary villagers into instruments of their own undoing. And the most terrifying part? None of them realized it yet. By the end of these sermons, the stage was set. The town believed itself chosen. The river, once a mere neighbor, became holy. Obedience was sanctified, dissent unthinkable. And all that remained was for the preacher to speak the words that would summon them to the water. As the preacher's influence spread, it did not go entirely unnoticed beyond the boundaries of the town. To those outside, the village appeared almost idyllic from a distance: neat wooden homes, a quiet market, children playing under the watchful eye of adults who seemed strangely disciplined. But for those who looked closer, there were signs, subtle, unsettling, that all was not as it seemed. The first visitors were merchants, bringing grain and supplies from neighboring towns. They noted the unusually long sermons, the near-religious devotion to the preacher, and the way villagers' eyes followed him as if he were a sun around which they revolved. Questions they asked casually, about crops, about illness, about weather, were met with curt responses or awkward silence. Some left uneasy, others whispered to each other about the growing fanaticism. Soon, more official outsiders arrived. A priest from a neighboring parish came, carrying letters of concern from higher authorities. He observed the gatherings, discreetly noting the devotion bordering on mania. But when he tried to speak to the preacher privately, the man's demeanor shifted instantly, charming and respectful outwardly, but with a cold, calculating edge that unsettled the priest's heart. "Faith is a private matter," he said softly, eyes glinting, "and ours is stronger than yours can imagine." The priest left the village shaken, realizing that he was dealing not with an ordinary zealot but with a master manipulator. Journalists soon caught wind of the growing notoriety. One reporter, a woman with a keen eye for human stories, came to document the town's supposed miracle of unity. What she found instead was a community on edge, fearful, and fiercely protective of their preacher. She asked innocuous questions about family life, about education, about why certain villagers were absent. Each answer came with a pause, a glance, or an uneasy smile that betrayed tension beneath the surface. By the second night, her notes became filled with ellipses and question marks. Something was wrong, something she could not yet name. Attempts at intervention were met with subtle intimidation at first. A merchant who voiced concerns about the preacher's influence found barrels of his goods mysteriously destroyed. The visiting priest noticed children being warned in whispers not to speak to strangers. Journalists felt the eyes of the town follow them constantly. It was as though the village itself were alive with vigilance, prepared to protect the man who had claimed divine authority over them. But as outsiders pressed further, the town's paranoia became palpable. Villagers whispered among themselves, eyes darting to the edges of the gathering. Mothers clutched their children, fathers stood taller, silently daring anyone to challenge the narrative they had been taught to hold sacred. The preacher, aware of these outside observers, used their presence to reinforce loyalty. In sermons, he began to speak of the dangers lurking beyond the hills, outsiders who sought to corrupt their faith, to destroy their salvation, to take away the divine promise that had been entrusted to them. One chilling account comes from a traveling merchant who stayed at the town for several days. He recalled being summoned to the preacher's presence late at night. The preacher's gaze, sharp and unrelenting, seemed to pierce through him. "We are a chosen people," he said quietly, "and anyone who does not understand that is not welcome here. Be careful whom you trust." The merchant fled the town soon after, shaken and unable to return, carrying with him the sense that he had narrowly escaped something he could neither explain nor comprehend. Even authorities who might have acted to investigate further were hindered. Messages sent to distant officials were delayed or lost. Requests for inspections of the town's records were ignored. The preacher's grip had extended beyond faith into a form of social control that outsiders found difficult to penetrate. And within the town, obedience was rewarded while dissent was subtly punished. A man who questioned the preacher's motives found his crops mysteriously failing. A woman who whispered doubt to her friend became socially isolated, treated with polite distance. Yet, despite the preacher's tightening grip, whispers of fear persisted. A visitor once noted, "You could see it in their eyes, they knew something was wrong, yet they clung tighter than ever to the man who promised them certainty." That tension, between doubt and devotion, would ultimately fuel the tragedy to come. The preacher had taught his followers to see outsiders not as guides but as threats, making intervention nearly impossible. And still, among those outsiders, rumors began to circulate of a great crossing, a night when the preacher promised ultimate deliverance. No one knew exactly what it meant, but the words themselves carried a weight that was almost tangible. Every visitor who heard them felt a chill, as if the air itself had thickened. And though none could have foreseen the full horror, an instinctive dread began to take root. The lesson was clear: no matter how well-intentioned the outsiders, they could not break the preacher's influence. He had woven fear, faith, and hope into a tapestry so dense that the town could not, would not, see anything else. The outsider's gaze, the authorities' letters, the cautious questions, all were powerless against the grip of his words and the obedience he demanded. By the end of this period, the stage was set. The town's paranoia and devotion had created a perfect storm. Outsiders would leave the town uneasy, convinced that something terrible was building, but powerless to stop it. And within the town, every whisper, every glance, every step was now aligned with the preacher's will. The river awaited, though no one outside yet understood its significance. The true horror was no longer hidden, it was merely waiting, silent but inevitable. By this point, the town was no longer merely a community, it had become a stage, every inhabitant a performer in a drama scripted entirely by the preacher. Daily life was meticulously orchestrated. The routines of work, prayer, and rest were reshaped into rituals that tested loyalty, endurance, and obedience. The simplest acts, drawing water from the well, tending animals, or greeting a neighbor, were reframed as moral decisions, each scrutinized in the quiet, watchful eyes of the preacher and his devoted inner circle. Morning began with long vigils at the small wooden chapel. Followers would kneel in silence as the preacher recited scripture, sometimes for hours. The words were no longer abstract, they carried weight, a tangible gravity that pressed on hearts and minds alike. Children, who once ran freely through the fields, now sat for hours, learning to control their bodies, their voices, and even their thoughts to reflect the faith he demanded. Parents encouraged it, convinced that strict obedience was a pathway to salvation. Fasting became more severe. It was no longer a symbolic act of devotion, it became a test of endurance. Meals were replaced with tiny sips of water or bitter herbs, and any deviation, any whisper of complaint, was noted, questioned, and often punished. A father once tried to feed his child in secret. The preacher learned of it within the day, and the man was summoned publicly. Without raising his voice, the preacher conveyed a cold, suffocating sense of judgment, leaving the father shaken and terrified. Silence was restored, fear interwoven with devotion. Nightfall brought its own form of discipline. Villagers gathered in the chapel or around open fires for hours-long sermons and meditations. Torches cast flickering shadows that danced across faces, exaggerating expressions of fear and awe. The preacher spoke of visions, floods that would cleanse, storms that would purify, and a final crossing that would separate the faithful from the unworthy. He never detailed the mechanics of this crossing, but the ambiguity only heightened tension. Every follower speculated in hushed tones, unable to resist imagining the unknown, their curiosity and dread tightly entwined. The psychological toll on the town was immense. Children began sleepwalking through the night, murmuring scripture in their sleep. Elders, who had once questioned authority, now spoke only in measured phrases, repeating the preacher's words like mantras. Families fractured internally as obedience became paramount. Husbands and wives argued in silence, parents scolded children for imperfection, neighbors watched each other warily. Any sign of weakness was considered dangerous. The preacher had turned faith into both shield and weapon, molding the town into a community of constant scrutiny and pressure. Meanwhile, the preacher's prophecies grew darker and more specific. He spoke of a night when the river would call, a night when only complete devotion could guarantee salvation. He painted vivid pictures of what would happen to those who faltered, drowning not just in water, but in sin, forever condemned. And yet, he also promised unparalleled deliverance to those who trusted him completely. The duality, fear and reward, became an inescapable magnet. He began incorporating public displays of obedience. Volunteers were chosen to demonstrate their faith in front of the entire town, fasting for days, reciting scripture for hours, or enduring minor punishments. These performances reinforced the idea that compliance was not optional, that the preacher's word was law, and that disobedience carried consequences that were both immediate and eternal. Each demonstration intensified the sense of inevitability. The great crossing would come, and all must be ready. By now, even the most skeptical individuals were caught in a web of tension, fear, and devotion. A mother wrote secretly in her diary, "I know this cannot be right, but if I do not obey, am I condemning my children?" And yet, when I look at him, I feel an undeniable truth in his voice, a certainty that I cannot deny. Others tried to resist internally, only to find themselves pulled back into the fold, drawn by the hypnotic cadence of the sermons and the peer pressure of a town entirely aligned with the preacher's will. The stage was meticulously set. Every household, every family, every individual had been conditioned, mentally and physically, to respond to the preacher's commands without question. Rumors of the outside world, warnings, investigations, or possible interference, were dismissed collectively. The town had closed in on itself, transforming isolation into security, skepticism into fear, and obedience into devotion. And yet, beneath the surface, subtle undercurrents of doubt persisted. Some whispered in private, hesitant to speak aloud. Others, haunted by fragments of memory or intuition, attempted to flee or warn outsiders but were intercepted. The preacher's network of surveillance was subtle yet absolute. Watchful eyes, whispered reports, carefully orchestrated rituals ensured that no one acted independently without consequence. Every day, the river became more than a backdrop to life. It was a symbol, a looming presence in sermons, visions, and warnings. Children were told to gaze at it and imagine its dual nature, cleansing yet deadly. Adults were told that their salvation, their ultimate reward, would be revealed there. Its waters were described in paradoxes, gentle yet merciless, forgiving yet exacting. And the town, fully absorbed, could do nothing but prepare themselves for the crossing that had been whispered into their lives for months. By the time the preacher announced the exact date of the great crossing, the town was poised on the edge of obedience and terror. Every fast, every vigil, every public display of faith had led to this moment. The people had been stripped bare of normalcy, softened and reshaped into a congregation ready to step into the river at his command. It was a crescendo that had taken months to build, psychological, emotional, and spiritual, leaving the town entirely under the preacher's control. And when the night arrived, the river awaited. The stage was set. The followers were ready. And the preacher, confident in the perfection of his orchestration, prepared to deliver the final command that would change everything. The night had fallen like a heavy curtain over the town, thick and suffocating. A damp fog crawled along the streets, clinging to the wooden walls of homes, muffling the faint sounds of the river in the distance. Inside the chapel, now illuminated by hundreds of flickering torches, the congregation had gathered as they had been instructed, silent, tense, and trembling with anticipation. Each face glowed in the firelight, reflecting the fear, hope, and devotion that had been carefully nurtured over months. The preacher stood at the pulpit, tall and imposing. He had spent weeks preparing for this night, his sermons rehearsed in his mind with the precision of a musician composing a symphony. This was the culmination, the moment he had promised would separate the faithful from the lost. His gaze swept over the room, resting briefly on each family, each child, each elder. He saw not individuals, but instruments ready to play their parts in a performance of ultimate obedience. He began softly, his voice low and hypnotic. Tonight, he intoned, we step beyond fear. We step into the embrace of the waters that wash away doubt, despair, and sin. Those who follow me shall know peace eternal. Those who hesitate shall find themselves consumed by their own hesitation. The congregation shivered. Some whispered prayers. Others clasped their children tightly. Every word seemed to press against their hearts like a physical force. The sermon slowly built, each sentence a careful escalation of tension. He spoke of prophecy, of visions granted to him in solitude, of signs in the sky and the river that would bear witness to the faithful. I have walked alone in darkness, he said, voice rising, I have seen the currents of fate. And I tell you now, the hour of crossing is upon us. The river waits. The night beckons. Do not falter. There were moments of terrifying stillness. The preacher would pause, letting the silence stretch until it felt unbearable. Torches flickered, shadows danced across the pews, and the congregation leaned forward instinctively, straining to hear each word. Even the children, whose minds should have wandered, remained hypnotized, their tiny hands folded, their eyes wide with a mix of awe and fear. Then he shifted, turning the sermon into a direct challenge. He singled out skeptics and doubters by name, men who had questioned his authority, women who had resisted his rituals, even teenagers whose hesitation had been noted during prayers. You who hesitate, he intoned, remember that salvation is not given lightly. The waters will claim only those whose faith is absolute. Decide now where you stand. The effect was electric. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some parents clutched their children tighter. Others bent low, whispering fervent promises to themselves, reaffirming their obedience. The preacher's cadence changed again, a roller coaster of tension and release. He moved from a whisper to a roar, from gentle admonishment to ecstatic praise. He described the river in vivid detail, dark and enveloping, a mirror of the unknown, yet simultaneously a path to ultimate redemption. The water does not judge, he declared, it accepts all who are chosen. Step forward with faith, and it will carry you to eternity. Every word was calculated, every pause intentional. The congregation's minds, already conditioned by months of fasting, vigils, and repeated sermons, were now trapped in a hypnotic loop. Doubt had been replaced with fear, curiosity replaced with obedience. Hearts pounded in unison, almost in sync with the preacher's voice, as if the town itself had become a single organism, responding to his command. By the climax of the sermon, he was no longer speaking, he was orchestrating. His gestures, the rise and fall of his voice, the pointed glances, all combined to create an irresistible force. Now, he declared, we cross together. Let the waters claim the faithful, let the night bear witness to our devotion. Follow, and you shall know peace. There was no hesitation. Not anymore. Not after months of preparation, of indoctrination, of psychological conditioning. The congregation rose as one, a silent, trembling river of humanity, moving toward the doors of the chapel and into the night. The torches cast long shadows behind them, stretching like fingers of fate reaching for the river. Children clung to parents, husbands held wives, elders shuffled forward with resigned determination. From outside, the chapel might have looked like any other night of prayer. But within, the atmosphere was electric with fear and awe. Hearts beat in sync with whispered prayers, voices unspoken yet collectively understood. Every follower was teetering on the edge of the unknown, and the preacher's voice carried them forward, steady, unrelenting, hypnotic. And then, at the final moment before stepping outside, he paused at the edge of the doorway, lifted his arms, and spoke one last line, the river calls. Trust in me, and it will carry you home. No one hesitated. The stage had been set, the actors primed, and the final act of obedience was about to unfold. The night was ready, the river awaited, and the preacher's command would soon be absolute. The night air was thick, damp with fog that rolled across the cobblestones and clung to the riverbanks like a living shroud. Torches flickered in the darkness, their light fractured by the mist, casting elongated, dancing shadows over the faces of those who followed. Hundreds of villagers, hearts pounding and breaths shallow, moved as one toward the river, silent, obedient, hypnotized. The preacher led the procession, his voice now a low, rhythmic chant, guiding each step as if he were both shepherd and conductor of this ominous ritual. Children clung to parents, parents held children tighter, and the elderly shuffled slowly, leaning on each other for support. The river, swollen by months of rain and prophecy, roared softly ahead, an unseen yet omnipresent force that promised deliverance and demanded obedience. Each step forward was deliberate, each movement synchronized. It was as if the town had become a single living organism, its heartbeat now bound to the cadence of the preacher's voice. The journey to the riverbank was longer than anyone outside could imagine. Every footfall was punctuated by whispered prayers, by subtle reassurances exchanged between neighbors, by fleeting glances of fear that were quickly swallowed by obedience. The preacher occasionally turned, raising his hands toward the sky, and spoke words that seemed to ripple through the crowd, "The water waits for the faithful. Step forward without doubt. The river shall carry us to eternity." As they reached the edge, the river's surface shimmered faintly in the torchlight, reflecting distorted images of faces that were tense, expectant, and terrified. Some cried silently, others trembled with excitement, and a few whispered apologies to the dark waters, promising that they were ready to be taken. No one hesitated, not anymore. By this point, the weeks of fasting, meditation, and psychological conditioning had rendered fear almost indistinguishable from faith. The preacher moved first, stepping into the cold water. It rose slowly, reaching his knees, then his waist, then his chest. Every ripple seemed to respond to his presence, as if the river itself recognized him as chosen. Behind him, a cascade of villagers followed, slipping carefully into the water, their bodies trembling from both cold and anticipation. The torches at the riverbank flickered wildly in the wind, casting grotesque shadows on the moving mass, shadows that made the scene look both surreal and apocalyptic. There were murmurs of prayer, stifled sobs, and the occasional gasp as someone lost footing and splashed into the current. Yet no one turned back. Not even the children, whose tiny hands were held firmly by parents. The preacher's words had created a gravitational pull stronger than instinct, a force that replaced survival with devotion. Each step further into the river felt like crossing an invisible threshold, a passage into both unknown peril and promised salvation. The water was colder than any had anticipated. It clawed at legs and torsos, shocking bodies with its intensity. Some stumbled, some cried out, but the flow of humanity carried them forward like leaves on a current. The preacher moved with deliberate calm, his face serene, eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the night. His followers mirrored him, their own faces a mix of reverence and terror. As they reached the deeper section of the river, the current began to tug more forcefully. Parents held children high, women clutched husbands, elders gripped walking sticks as if they could resist the pull. But resistance was futile, the river had become an extension of the preacher's will, its natural force intertwined with the psychological command he had cultivated. Fear and faith blended, indistinguishable, as the water rose past knees and waists, past chests, until it threatened to overwhelm those unprepared. From the riverbank, the scene was almost ritualistic, eerily beautiful in its choreography. The torches reflected in the water, creating twin rivers of light and shadow. The fog thickened, hiding the full extent of the depth, hiding the terrifying unknown beneath the surface. To an outsider, it may have appeared orderly, even serene. But for those inside, every heartbeat was a drum of uncertainty, every step a negotiation between instinct and devotion, life and belief. And then, as if on cue, the preacher's voice rose in final cadence, "Step forward. Trust in me. Let the waters cleanse, let the night witness your faith. There is no turning back." The words echoed across the river, swallowed by mist and amplified by fear. One by one, the villagers surrendered completely. Their bodies moved forward with no hesitation. The river embraced them, a living force carrying away the culmination of months of manipulation, preparation, and devotion. Some struggled, some wept, but the overwhelming current, both of water and of obedience, claimed them all. By the time dawn threatened the horizon, the river was quiet again, save for the gentle lapping of water against empty banks. Homes stood abandoned, the chapel silent, and the town, once vibrant with life, now existed only in memory and the distant echo of the preacher's words. It was in this moment, as the fog lifted and the first rays of sunlight touched the river, that the full magnitude of the tragedy was revealed. Hundreds of lives, ordinary men, women, and children, had been drawn into the water, leaving behind a ghost town that bore witness to the terrifying power of faith twisted into fanaticism. The river, now calm, carried secrets and sorrow alike, silent but inexorably linked to the preacher's will. The horror of what had transpired was not immediately grasped by the outside world. To understand it fully required piecing together fragmented testimonies, studying the careful orchestration, and confronting the terrifying truth. The river had not just taken lives, it had claimed souls, as imagined by the preacher, as intended by a man who had become a god in his own town. The morning after the river claimed its victims, the town was unrecognizable. Silence hung over the streets like a suffocating shroud. Doors swung open on empty homes. Hearths still smoldered from the previous night's vigil, but there were no hands to stoke the fires. Animals wandered aimlessly, the children's toys floated in abandoned yards, and the river, once a source of life, now seemed a grave, its waters carrying whispers of the night before. Outsiders arriving at the scene were met with a surreal tableau of devastation. There were no screams, no panic, only the ghostly remnants of a community that had vanished almost entirely. Officials, journalists, and nearby villagers could hardly comprehend the scale. Bodies were recovered along the riverbank, tangled with branches, dragged downstream, some partially submerged. It was immediately clear that this was not an accident of nature. The choreography, the precision, and the sheer number of people involved pointed to something deliberate, something horrifyingly orchestrated. Investigators faced a difficult task. The preacher, the orchestrator of this tragedy, had disappeared. Some claimed he had drowned himself, others whispered he had escaped under the cover of darkness, a shadow among shadows. Those who had survived the river, a handful who had resisted or were missed for trivial reasons, provided fragmented, traumatized accounts, each struggling to make sense of events that defied logic and morality. Witness testimonies painted a consistent yet disturbing picture. Months of psychological manipulation, of sermons that escalated in both duration and intensity, had conditioned the townspeople to obey without hesitation. Investigators noted how the congregation had acted as a collective organism, responding more to fear and indoctrination than to any natural instinct for survival. Experts in psychology and law would later describe it as one of the most extreme examples of mass obedience and coercive control ever documented. Survivors spoke reluctantly. One young girl recalled the preacher's final words, her voice shaking, "He told us the water would carry us to heaven. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. I couldn't move." Another survivor, a farmer, described gripping his child tightly as he stepped into the river, knowing something was wrong, yet feeling that faith itself compelled him forward. Their testimonies were filled with guilt, confusion, and grief, offering investigators a terrifying glimpse into the preacher's power over ordinary people. The media descended upon the town like vultures. Photographs of empty streets, abandoned homes, and scattered belongings filled newspapers. Headlines screamed of cults, fanaticism, and mass tragedy. Yet amidst the sensationalism, the true horror remained elusive, how one man's manipulation could override instinct, reason, and love, driving hundreds into their deaths. It was a story that defied simple explanations, a narrative too complex to fit neatly into newsprint. Authorities struggled with jurisdiction and accountability. The town had been isolated for months, communication with the outside world was sporadic. Records were incomplete. Questions remained: who had enabled this? How had the preacher gained so much influence? And perhaps most hauntingly, could such a tragedy ever happen again? Investigators worked tirelessly, piecing together evidence from the river, the abandoned homes, and survivor accounts, but answers were partial, fragmented, often contradictory. Even after months of investigation, the psychological footprint of the preacher lingered. Survivors exhibited signs of trauma and disorientation. Families that had lost entire lineages struggled to reconcile the reality of what had happened. Communities beyond the town whispered in fear and fascination, warning their own children, neighbors, and congregations about the dangers of blind faith and charismatic authority. And then there were the moral questions that investigators could not answer. Was the preacher evil, or was he simply a product of a world that had conditioned him, molded by isolation, poverty, and a desire for significance? Could the townspeople have resisted, or were they too far gone, victims of circumstance and manipulation? These questions haunted every report, every news article, every official memorandum. The river, calm once again, reflected the sky as if nothing had happened. But the memory of that night, of obedient bodies moving as one, of faith weaponized into tragedy, could not be washed away. Investigators, journalists, and survivors alike would carry its weight for the rest of their lives, a chilling reminder of what can occur when desperation, manipulation, and blind obedience converge. After the tragedy, the preacher vanished without a trace. Authorities scoured nearby towns, forests, and river paths, yet all searches returned empty-handed. Some whispered that he had drowned deliberately, merging with the very river he had sanctified. Others insisted he had fled, a shadow moving through the night, carrying with him the secrets of manipulation and terror. His absence became a haunting presence, as though the town's collective obedience had left behind a lingering specter of his will. Stories of sightings emerged in distant villages. Travelers claimed to have glimpsed a tall, solemn figure wandering alone at dusk, eyes distant yet commanding. Merchants spoke of receiving letters, unsigned, cryptic, warning of salvation and damnation. Some suggested he was preparing another town for his doctrine, a new stage for a similar tragedy. Whether true or false, these rumors fueled both fear and morbid fascination. The preacher, though unseen, remained omnipresent in the minds of those who had experienced his sermons. His legacy extended far beyond physical presence. Scholars, psychologists, and theologians debated the mechanisms of his control. How could one man manipulate hundreds into obedience so absolute that instinct, love, and survival instincts were overruled? How had he cultivated fear and faith simultaneously, bending both to serve his purpose? His methods became case studies in coercive persuasion, a chilling reminder of the potential for human influence when desperation and charisma collide. Within the town itself, the preacher's memory persisted as both legend and warning. Survivors recounted his voice, the cadence of his words, and the rituals he had enforced. Children who had been spared the river's pull grew into adults haunted by fragments of his sermons, replaying them in their minds in moments of fear or doubt. Families who lost loved ones struggled with grief compounded by bewilderment, unable to reconcile the man they had known with the horrors of that night. His teachings, though never written down, were preserved in whispers and oral retellings. Local folklore began to intertwine with factual memory, giving rise to a mythos around the preacher. He became a cautionary figure, a symbol of the dangers of blind obedience and the seductive power of charismatic authority. Villagers spoke of him in hushed tones, recounting tales that blurred the line between reality and legend. Some even visited the riverbank years later, leaving small offerings, a mixture of fear, respect, and unresolved reverence. Across the wider region, his story influenced communities far removed from the town. Religious leaders cautioned against unchecked zealotry. Psychologists referenced the case as an extreme study in mass manipulation. And in popular culture, books, articles, and documentaries began to explore the tragedy, ensuring that the preacher's shadow extended far beyond the banks of that river. Yet, despite analysis, debate, and investigation, a fundamental question remained unanswered: what drove him to orchestrate such a massacre? Was it pure belief, delusion, or the pursuit of power? Did he perceive himself as a savior, or was he fully aware of the terror he inflicted? This ambiguity, unresolved and uncomfortable, is perhaps the most enduring aspect of his legacy. It is what keeps the story alive, haunting the imagination, forcing those who hear it to confront the darkest corners of faith and obedience. In the end, the preacher's disappearance and the river tragedy became intertwined, inseparable in memory and consequence. The river flowed on, indifferent to the lives lost and the lessons carved into history. Yet the preacher's presence lingered, intangible yet undeniable, a reminder that the line between salvation and destruction can be frighteningly thin when human conviction is exploited. The legacy of the preacher was not just in the lives he claimed, but in the ripple effects, the psychological scars, the cultural caution, and the haunting reminder that faith, when weaponized, can lead to devastation beyond comprehension. And in the shadows of the town and the minds of survivors, his voice never fully faded, echoing with the same cadence that once drew hundreds into the river's embrace. Years have passed since the river claimed its victims, yet the echoes of that night remain vivid, lingering in minds, memories, and whispered stories. The town itself, once a vibrant hub of life, is now a place of silent reflection, homes abandoned, streets empty, and the river continuing its ceaseless flow, indifferent to human tragedy. Yet for those who survived, and for the wider world that later learned of the events, the story remains a chilling reminder of the power of human belief and the dangers of manipulation. Psychologists and historians have analyzed the tragedy endlessly, attempting to extract meaning from chaos. The preacher's methods reveal the terrifying potential of coercion when combined with charisma, isolation, and fear. He demonstrated how ordinary individuals, pushed and guided carefully, can be transformed into agents of obedience, even to their own destruction. Survivors often report that the experience has left them with an enduring sense of hyper-awareness, a persistent question in every decision: am I being manipulated? Am I truly free to choose? The tragedy also forced communities far beyond the town to confront uncomfortable truths about faith, authority, and vigilance. Religious leaders, scholars, and ordinary citizens alike began to question blind adherence and the seduction of charismatic figures. Conversations arose about how isolation, poverty, or social cohesion could be exploited to devastating effect. The lessons were universal: unchecked authority, combined with desperation and belief, can unleash consequences beyond imagination. Survivors, carrying their guilt and grief, became living testaments to both vulnerability and resilience. Some dedicated their lives to education, warning others of the dangers of manipulation and mass obedience. Others struggled privately, haunted by memories of loved ones lost and by the knowledge that, despite instinct, they had been drawn into the current of the preacher's will. Every anniversary of the river's tragedy brought quiet reflection, a reminder that human nature, in all its complexity, can be both beautiful and terrifying. The river, ever flowing, serves as both a literal and symbolic reminder of the events. It is a mirror reflecting the fragility of trust, the danger of surrendering judgment, and the haunting reality that tragedy can emerge from devotion. Visitors to the site often describe a heavy stillness, a sense that the past lingers in the water, in the mists, in the very air around it. The preacher's absence does not erase his impact; in a sense, he remains present in every lesson, every memory, and every warning passed down. Perhaps the most haunting aspect is not the mass tragedy itself, but the subtle ways it continues to resonate. In books, documentaries, and academic studies, the story of the preacher and the river serves as a case study in human susceptibility, in the fine line between faith and fanaticism. It reminds us that power is not always wielded openly, that control can be subtle, and that fear can be as binding as love. The tragedy becomes not only a historical event but a moral compass, guiding reflection on obedience, morality, and the responsibility to question authority. And yet, despite all analysis, there is an undeniable sorrow, the emotional weight of lives lost, of families torn apart, of innocence consumed. The preacher's sermons, once mesmerizing, are now echoes of horror. The river, once a path to imagined salvation, stands as a quiet, enduring monument to the consequences of human devotion turned destructive. The lessons linger because they are deeply personal and painfully universal. Vigilance, empathy, and critical thinking are essential shields against manipulation. In the final reflection, the story of the preacher and his town endures as a dark, haunting fable of human psychology, faith, and tragedy. It is a tale of ordinary people swept up in extraordinary circumstances, of the delicate balance between guidance and coercion, and of the terrifying power of belief when placed in the wrong hands. It is a story that demands remembrance, reflection, and respect for the fragility of human decision-making. The river continues to flow, indifferent and eternal, but its waters carry the memory of those who trusted too deeply, of a community undone by faith weaponized, and of the haunting question that remains for every listener, reader, or viewer: what would you do if someone spoke with the power to bend your mind, your heart, and your will, and you believed them completely?